Welcome back to Adventures in Blockchain. This is the podcast that's all about blockchain development. So I'm Gregory from DAP University, and I've got my co-panelist Bruno on today. So welcome, Bruno.
Hi, guys. How are you? Nice having you again in the podcast.
Yeah. So today we're excited to talk about this question, which blockchain is best? So this is a really common question that people have that I've seen when they're, programmers and they're getting into blockchain and they say, I see all these different blockchains out there. Which one should I pick? Right. So we're going to dive into that today. All right. So the short answer to this question, and we're going to unpack this throughout the rest of this episode, is it depends. Right. Just like any other complicated question, it depends. All right. So what does it depend on? So there's lots of different factors. Okay. And I'm going to kind of weigh in on some of my perspective on this. Bruno's going to weigh in on his perspective because we both kind of have a little bit different backgrounds in blockchain. We've each worked with different blockchains. So we're going to have, some different experience to weigh in on this. And I'll go ahead and kick us off. Does that work, Bruno?
Sure. Go ahead.
Cool. Awesome. So, it depends on what you want to do, right? And it ultimately comes down to the use case. Why are you using a blockchain in the first place? And what are you trying to accomplish? So you have to kind of start with that question, right? To start with the end in mind and work your way backwards and pick the right tool for the job. So, what are some other potential tools available? And what do they do? How will they help you, meet your ultimate goal or satisfy the use case that you're going after, right? So I'll start with, what I know best, which is, Ethereum, right? Ethereum is a public blockchain. I'll explain that more in a minute, right? It's a very widely used public blockchain. It's got a really active development community. And people are using Ethereum quite a bit to solve business cases right now with public blockchain. Okay, and I teach Ethereum almost exclusively on my YouTube channel, DAP University, on my website, dapuniversity.com, and inside my Blockchain Developer Bootcamp. Right, and there's lots of reasons why. Because it's a very versatile blockchain that does a lot of things, right? It supports smart contracts, which are basically programs that run on the blockchain. It has a native cryptocurrency called Ether, which can be bought and sold on cryptocurrency exchanges and used to pay network fees and stuff like that. And it's got, a really active team that's developing Ethereum, improving the protocol, and making it a real game changer in the long run for this blockchain ecosystem. So, what are some of the types of things that you can do on Ethereum and maybe other blockchains? And we'll kind of talk about those. And we'll also talk about kind of another part of this equation, which is our private blockchains. So I'll let Bruno just kind of for a minute explain what that means and how that might be different from a public blockchain.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I just wanted to go back a little bit and say that the first question that you should ask yourself when you're sort of like dwelling into developing with blockchain and stuff is, does it really, achieve what I want to do? Think about, okay, I want to create an app I want it to be a simple to-do list or something. Is it really necessary to have a blockchain behind that app, working with that app to create that app? It really comes down to what are you going to do and what are your goals and like time and resources that you're going to spend on that. And one big difference between public blockchains, like Gregory mentioned Ethereum, and private blockchains such as Hyperledger, for example, is the control. Who's in control of the blockchain? Think about any kind of app that you create. You need to host it in a server or a workstation of some sort. And in the case of Ethereum, for example, correct me if I'm wrong, Gregory, but like whatever app that you develop, the business logic of that app that works on blockchain is going to be hosted by Ethereum, right?
That's correct. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So in a lot of business scenarios, you don't really want that to happen. Either by contract or legal stuff, or just by being afraid of giving out sensitive information to public places like that. So you want to be in control of your information. You want to host your own information. And with private blockchains, you can just create the blockchain and host it yourself. You organize the blockchain and you have control, to give permissions and who's going to access this blockchain, who's not going to access it, who's important in this blockchain, who's not. So you give control to that while not letting go of the great aspects of blockchain, which are security and transparency. So you can have all of that in the private blockchains without going to hosting everything on a third party. And I think that's the biggest difference on private blockchains.
Sure. So let's talk about that a little bit on public versus private blockchains. So public blockchain, like Bruno mentioned, is basically a blockchain implementation where theoretically anyone could be a node on the network or a user of the network on some kind, or connect to a node, right? So essentially what that means is, blockchain is a peer-to-peer network. And in a public blockchain, it's a public network, right? And anyone with access to the blockchain can use it, right? They could store information on it. They could, retrieve information from it. They could potentially participate in the mining or validating process when new blocks are created on that public blockchain, right? Mm. And there's, different reasons why you would want to use a public versus a private. Bruno mentioned some, advantages of private blockchains over public, and sometimes it does depend on the use case, right? So I'll talk about some of the use cases for, using something like Ethereum, right? For example. So, Ethereum, like I said, has its own native cryptocurrency called Ether, and it, supports smart contracts that can be, put on the blockchain, and basically programs are on the blockchain. And what we're seeing a lot these days are, basically blockchain applications or programs or blockchain use cases that have some sort of economic use case. It's particularly ones where cryptocurrency is involved, do really well in these types of applications, right? Mm-hmm. Where smart contracts are essentially work really well with working with financial transactions and working around business logic around these financial transactions that exist on the blockchain in a decentralized way, right? And that's really one of the keys, this idea of decentralization as a need for some users and maybe not for others, right? And this is usually a sliding scale. So decentralization basically is this idea of trying to take as much control as possible or power as possible away from a central entity, right? And this usually comes with some sort of trade-off, right, in favor of a decentralized structure, right? So if you look at a blockchain network in itself, right, like a blockchain that's just made up of a bunch of computers that all talk to one another, that don't have a central server, right? This is sort of an idea of a decentralized network where, anyone can essentially hook up to this network and participate in it, right? There's no necessarily company that just manages things on a centralized infrastructure, right? And so a cryptocurrency is a really good example of why you might want to use a decentralized network, because you basically would want people that aren't necessarily don't have the power to manipulate the currency to participate in running it, essentially, right? In maintaining a copy of who owns a certain amount of cryptocurrency, right? And that's a really key use case for using a public blockchain, because you wouldn't necessarily want a single company or a single, organization of some kind to, say how much money I have in my wallet, right? I'd rather that be a democratic, decentralized sort of concept. Does that make sense?
Yeah. If you think about like let's talk about like the real world of currencies. Like if you think about, say, for example, me and Gregory, we want to create a transaction between ourselves. I want to send $10 to Gregory, online, not physically. If I were to do it in the traditional way, I would need a third party, such as a bank, for example, or
Right.
PayPal or whatever. A intermediator that would do that transaction for me. And I would believe them saying, okay, your $10 were like taken from your account and credited into Gregory's account, But if you think about the decentralized way of doing it, it's basically like the physical money itself. You take a $10 bill and I give it to Gregory. It doesn't have to go through a third party saying that my account has been debited or credited or whatever. I just give it to him, and everyone around acknowledges that I've given the $10 to him, and now the $10 are Gregory's. It's not mine anymore. It's sort of like the same thing if you think about the decentralized way of doing those transactions, and that's one of the reasons why it's so easy to grasp the transaction, like financial use case for the blockchain. But when you start thinking about keeping records of any sort of asset that you want, say, for example, I don't know, like IBM is doing with Food Trust. It's a program that they run where you go to a supermarket or something and you're going to buy a pack of carrots, for example. You can see in the packet itself where the carrots are coming from, what was the whole process and history of those carrots. And that is done by the blockchain, because the blockchain provides you with the security of information and the transparency, and that kind of use case, you don't really want to take business information and put it in a public blockchain. There is some information that you want everyone to see, sort of like where the carrot came from, but there's other information that you don't want to see, like, okay, how much money did farm 123 make with those carrots? That's some sort of like private information, and only that farm wants to know. It doesn't want everyone to know that information, but it's still useful to go through the blockchain because you have a single excuse me, you have a single like system to deal with everything.
Right. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And yeah, totally. So Bruno is talking about, some different kinds of business cases that expose or hide information, right? And, we're working on, similar types of approaches for public blockchains where we're being able to store private data and things like that. So also, I want to focus on really where the blockchains are right now and what we can do with them in sort of a mainstream way. This is still a very early time, and, a lot of people are trying to iron out concrete implementations for specific use cases. And a lot of people have already actually gotten there. They just haven't been adopted at scale just yet. So one thing, I'll mention, stuff that's doing really well right now on public blockchain implementations that have their own cryptocurrencies, like Ethereum, for example. What are some of the big use cases that people have been widely adopted and widely used already by lots and lots of people? Well, one of the first things that Ethereum was really good at was creating tokens. All right. So a token is a specific type of cryptocurrency. All right. So if you think about, if you get on like a website like CoinMarketCap or something like that, and you look at all these different cryptocurrencies on there, some of these terms are somewhat hard to define, but you'll see stuff like coin, you'll see token, essentially they're both currencies. But generally speaking, people talk about coins as the native cryptocurrencies that are on a blockchain, right? So Bitcoin is a coin, for example, because it's essentially originally it was rewarded to miners for maintaining the network, right? That's why it's called a Bitcoin. And like Ether, for example, the native cryptocurrency on the Ethereum blockchain, some people also just call it Ethereum. That's technically a coin. So you'll see some of these other cryptocurrencies on Ethereum, which are tokens. Okay. And essentially, these are cryptocurrencies that are powered by smart contracts on the network. And so why was this such a game changer? Why was this such a big deal? Well, when Ethereum created this protocol for tokens, it essentially allowed you to create your own cryptocurrency without creating your own blockchain. Okay, and that's a huge deal, because if you were going to create a new coin and create your own blockchain, you would need to create a new network. And essentially, you might be able to fork an existing protocol and tweak it slightly, right? Or make your own improvements, or maybe even just copy it completely. But you would still have to convince a lot of people to run the network in order to maintain some sort of security advantage and actually achieve decentralization, right? You would have to.
It's not that. It's like you still like not just creating the network, but also maintaining it and
right.
making sure that it's secure and it's still working, right?
Right. So the bottom line is there's a huge gap to cross if you want to start your own blockchain to create your own cryptocurrency. But like when Ethereum came along and allowed you to create your own cryptocurrency without doing all that with smart contracts, it was, as easy as creating, some code and deploying it to a blockchain. I mean, that's a complete game changer, right? So it essentially allows you to bootstrap your own cryptocurrency on top of the existing Ethereum network. And so that was, a major use case. And that's one that people are still doing all the time. Huge mainstream adoption for that, I would say. I mean, maybe not mainstream in the sense, I'm using that term loosely, right? Not like your grandma is holding Ethereum tokens necessarily, right? But there are very, very big use case in the blockchain ecosystem, relatively speaking. And so, we saw a lot of that early on, especially like in 2017 with the big ICO boom that happened. People realized that they could create their own currencies quickly and raise capital for their projects by issuing these tokens, right? And you saw a lot of people even bootstrap their own blockchains this way by first issuing tokens on Ethereum and then migrating their currencies to a native currency later on a different blockchain. And, that was proof that there was a really good use case for having code on the blockchain that was public that people could interact with, where essentially this smart contract acted like a vending machine. You paid, some money into it and it gave you what you expected, which were tokens, and they were valuable and you could sell them and make a lot of money. So that was, one of the first big kind of breakthroughs that we saw with this. And people are experimenting with this like all the time with other types of financial transactions. We can do escrows, we can do lots of different stuff. People, security tokens are a big thing that are happening in the space right now too. But yeah, that's an example of something that went really well with something like Ethereum in a decentralized way, where you wanted lots of people to, maintain this network. And, we saw a lot of acceleration with the ecosystem whenever this happened.
I do have a sort of like a question though.
Sure.
Like if you think about blockchain, like in a very simple concept, you think about a decentralized database or somewhere to store information, right?
Mm-hmm.
And on the Ethereum, you say that, with the smart contracts and everything, you can basically program your own information into the blockchain.
Mm-hmm.
But you said that there are different types of coins and tokens inside Ethereum. Is everything one huge network? Or is it like when you create a new coin, for example, you create a little piece of your own network inside this bigger network?
Sure. So whenever you create a new cryptocurrency on top of Ethereum, you're always creating a token, right? So, Ethereum, like I said earlier, has a native cryptocurrency called Ether. That's really its coin at that point. Some people just call this Ethereum. Like if you get on coinmarketcap.com, I think, Ethereum is what they call it.
Right.
And that's more just like brand recognition. So that's the only native cryptocurrency on Ethereum, and that runs across the entire network natively. Like if you download an Ethereum wallet, you're gonna have the ability to store Ether out of the box. So when you create a new token with smart contracts, it still utilizes the entire network. You're not like sharding the network into smaller networks or anything like that. You're not really creating any kind of new blockchain infrastructure necessarily. You're basically creating a piece of code that kind of looks like a class-based, object-oriented program. If you're coming from a different background, that's kind of what a smart contract is. It's like in object-oriented languages, objects and classes are like sort of the basic building blocks of those types of programs. So for programs, blockchain programs on Ethereum, smart contracts are the basic building blocks of those types of things. So you basically create this thing that kind of looks like a class that basically says, here's who owns how many tokens. Here's how they can transfer them. Here's how they can allow other people to transfer them. And here's how many there are total, stuff like that. Basically, all the business logic and sort of like CRUD actions, basically, that would determine the behavior of a cryptocurrency are all contained inside that smart contract.
Right. But then, like when you develop a new coin, for example, or token, right? Are you like when you create the transactions between your users? So create, I don't know, an adventure coin. If I transact those adventure coins, and am I transacting like pieces of Ethereum, or am I actually transacting my coins?
So you're transacting your coins. So let's take your example that you brought up. Like say you created an adventure coin, right?
Right.
And you hold some adventure coin and you want to send some to me. All right. So that requires you to actually hold two different currencies in your wallet. You have to have some adventure coin, and then you have to have a small amount of Ether or Ethereum. So essentially what you would do is once you've added adventure coin to your wallet, you would, say send adventure coins to me. And then Ethereum is going to require you to pay a little bit of gas from Ethereum, its own native cryptocurrency itself, in order to make that transaction.
Right. So it's sort of like, if you think about it, it's sort of like a tax for using their network or something like that.
Yeah, essentially. And that goes to reward the people who maintain the network, right? That's sort of the incentive to become a miner.
So like people that maintain it is like everyone that's using it, right?
Yeah. So certain people on the network actually opt into the mining process. Not everyone has to. But whenever the transaction is mined, the miner that actually submitted their proof and was rewarded, that's who gets the currency that you sent.
Right. Gotcha. Yeah, it sounds really interesting the way it works. But like I said, I come from a private blockchain scenario, and to me, it still seems kind of weird, like thinking about a big business, for example. You want to do, I don't know, say you want to do all of your transactions, whether like everything, your cash flow, you want to put it in a secure place like a blockchain. How would you convince a big company like that to put everything, like every kind of record that they have on a public blockchain like that? Because like to me, it just seems like kind of like everyone can have access to the information of like where money is going to.
Right. Right. So, people are trying to figure out, people are trying to answer the types of questions about what is essential to put on the blockchain and what is not essential. And sort of in this early adoption phase, we're answering those questions, and people are finding, good alternatives. Like I said, you have to choose the right tool for the job. But people are also finding that you can, store hashed information on the blockchain. You can store different pieces of information and make some compromises on centralization versus decentralization, and really just using blockchain for important parts. Now, it may not be the right tool for someone to store a lot of sensitive information on specific blockchains as they exist right now, right? And, like we said earlier in the episode, it's like you have to ask yourself, why do you want to use the blockchain in the first place? What are you trying to accomplish, right? Is it possible? There's lots of questions businesses have to ask themselves. And, so that's something definitely to consider when you're looking at the state as it is right now. But there's also nothing to say that we won't have really good answers for these things in the near future.
Yeah, for sure. Like you said, it's like an early adoption phase. We're still like figuring out what we should do with blockchain, what we shouldn't do, put in the blockchain. And I think that one big aspect of, whatever app you're creating and to decide if you're going to use the blockchain or not is, you don't have to put everything into a single blockchain either. You can use like part of your app you can do in a private blockchain, part of your app you can do in a public blockchain, and the rest of it you can just use no blockchain at all. It's really up to you what kind of performance and stability you want to have regarding to which blockchain you're going to use.
Yeah, there's always trade-offs. And I talk about this a lot on my YouTube channel, and also just whenever I'm explaining this to people who ask me, right? Like, especially among the really early adopters for blockchain, like Ethereum, for example, a strong sentiment in that community is decentralization, right? A very strong sentiment to want to take, put control in the hands of the people, or put power in the hands of people. Maybe is better way of saying that. So there are some use cases where people want to decentralize as much as possible, even like the assets to the interface, right? Or, what I mean? So basically, like if you had a website that was connected to your smart contracts, essentially some people want to try to take the assets that run that website and store them in a decentralized way. And there are approaches to doing this. There's something called like the interplanetary file system or something like that. And other ways. Some people even say just don't, use user interfaces, basically just be a programmer and, run your own node and transact with smart contracts through a command line interface, essentially. Like there's, so basically there's going to be very niche, hyper niche use cases that can be served in that way. But that's one of the trade-offs, right? You can be 100% decentralized or as close to 100% as you can possibly be, but it's always going to serve a hyper niche use case, right? And the more people you want to serve, there some compromises might have to be made where you can still maintain a lot of what you want or even most of what you want, but still reach and serve more people. And one really good example would just be a really fast, high performance website that people can access, right? That looks nice and converts and all that kind of stuff, but still, talks to the blockchain and uses it for what it's good for, and lets other tools of the application do what they're good at.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah. Changing a little bit of the conversation, like I said, I come from a private blockchain scenario. And one big thing that I've learned across the years that I've worked is that the business world, it works very differently from, just our regular everyday world. One main thing about the blockchain for business is solving a supply chain problem that we have that is like synchronization of assets. So think about a big supply chain, say, for example, I don't know, think about Starbucks, right? Where does it buy its coffee from? Who's the supplier I'm sure they have like plenty of suppliers across the globe. And one big thing that, like, one big problem that they might have is how to make sure, or how to know that, the shipment of 100 tons of coffee that I got from this supplier actually arrived where it needed to. Because we use different systems, we use different applications. My company uses something, your company uses something completely different. How do I synchronize all of that? And at least here in Brazil, what most big companies do, companies like Coca-Cola, Pepsi, and whatever, what they usually do is use spreadsheets to synchronize all of that. Say I sold this amount of this product to this person, to this company, and this company bought this much product from whoever. Synchronizing all of that is usually done via spreadsheets. And that's one thing that we could solve with blockchain, thinking about Hyperledger and its scenarios and its use cases. We could put all of those transactions, say you're selling the coffee, you could put the transactions of the coffee itself, make the coffee itself a token or an asset. And every transaction that you make, your goal is not to like make the transaction itself, but rather create a history of all the transactions that are being made, and have all of those records in a clean way and secure way, and knowing that you can't change a past transaction. It's immutable data. So I think that's one of the brightest scenarios for private blockchains, and where we can use them for the best use case that we've come up with so far. And it's a really interesting one, if you think that you can solve all of those things just by using blockchain,
Right. Yeah, very cool. So what have been your biggest pain points with these types of implementations?
The main thing with these implementations is always infrastructure. Because if you think about it, like, in at least on the Hyperledger way, every company or every member of the blockchain is supposed to have its own infrastructure. So think about, like, say, for example, Coca-Cola and Starbucks. Starbucks is supposed to have its own infrastructure and its own people that are dedicated to working with the blockchain. And Coca-Cola is supposed to have its own people that are supposed to work with the blockchain to keep it in a true decentralized way. Like, we don't have to go, like, put all of those transactions between a third party. We can just use Starbucks and Coca-Cola themselves. We don't need a third company, delegating the transactions and infrastructure and everything. And that's the biggest problem that we have to show the companies today, and solving those infrastructure problems, because running a blockchain isn't something cheap.
Right.
You need to have a lot of resources to run the blockchain and make sure it's running efficiently. And frameworks like or projects rather, like Hyperledger, are working on making the blockchain, like making a blockchain that's lighter. It can run faster. But since there's a lot of pieces involved in a blockchain, and you need to have that security and that transparency, there's a lot of things that you can't live without in a blockchain. And it's really, like, expensive to run that infrastructure and have the manpower to maintain that infrastructure. But apart from that, today, at least with Hyperledger project, it's really easy to create and develop your own blockchain. You can use IBM's services to create your own blockchain. They have what they call the IBM blockchain platform, where it's just like an interface online, where you just click and you create the nodes and you create the workers for your blockchain, you delegate all the infrastructure yourself. But then, like I said, if you're the one doing that for a large network, you're sort of like centralizing the power of who can maintain that network. Ideally, every company needs to have its own infrastructure for that. And it's more like a business thing of like how much you're willing to spend to that and how you're going to convince the businesses to work with that. But the technology itself, it doesn't differ like much from Ethereum's smart contracts, for example. In Hyperledger, we call them the crap. I forgot the word. But anyways,
The
we do
chain
have
code?
chain code. Yes,
That's
thank
right.
you. Yeah, we do have the chain codes, which are essentially the smart contracts, and it works the same way. You just develop JavaScript and you develop your own applications and that the business logics and everything, and you deploy that into the blockchain. It works in a very similar fashion. Um, but the thing is, you have all these permissions and the memberships. Each member of the network can have a set of permissions. Who's willing, like who's allowed to read and write specific data. You can have a member in the blockchain that is only allowed to read something, and you can have another member that's only allowed to write something. And that's the main aspect of the private blockchains, at least with Hyperledger, for example.
Right. Yeah. I think also a key word being in there, permissioned. That's one that you see flying around a lot. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's true. Because like you can have different members. Say, for example, you have a company, again with the Starbucks example, you have Starbucks. Within Starbucks, you have different people that are going to access that blockchain. Say they have I don't know, a floor in their building that has a team with 10 people working with the blockchain, which those people's jobs is to maintain the blockchain side of Starbucks. And within those then 10 people, you can have like two administrators, you can have two developers, you can have different permissions within the same member of the blockchain. So it's a very complex permissioned system, and it's like you can really have control of who you want to within your company, who you want to access the blockchain or not. But that doesn't change the outcome of the network itself, because members of the blockchain, the companies, they're treated as a single node in the blockchain, and within that node they have multiple nodes inside and everything.
Right. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. So, you mentioned some of these big companies. Are these just examples for hypothetical purposes, or are these companies that are actually using these types of technologies?
I know that IBM is really focused on the on bringing more companies into the blockchain world. I know that Starbucks is doing something with blockchain. I just don't know if it's the coffee, supply chain or whatever. Coca-Cola was just an example, really a hypothetical one. But if you want to dig deeper into, which companies are using blockchain for that, you can go to IBM's website or the Hyperledger project, and you can see a lot of the projects that they are working on with a few different companies. And one big case that we have for blockchain in this business world, or like at least aside from cryptocurrencies, is the city of Dubai. They have a project for, I think it's 2020 that they're going to launch it or something, where they call it the smart city. They're putting a lot of like bureaucracy and signing contracts and everything like that. They're putting it into a blockchain. They're transforming Dubai to be a blockchain based city. And it's really interesting when you dig into the project and you see what they're doing and what they want to achieve. And it's a big use case for these permission blockchains.
Right. Wow. Yeah, very cool. Well, Bruno, I think we've done a pretty good job of, covering this topic about, why you might want to use a public blockchain versus a private blockchain, some of the use cases, all that kind of stuff. Before we wrap up, is there anything else you think we should cover?
Um, I don't know. I don't think so. I think this is what we had planned for this episode, and I think that the main message that we should tell our viewers here is that it really depends. Really, like you said in the beginning, the answer is quite simple. It depends on what you're working with and what you're trying to achieve. But like always try to study, analyze your options before you dig deeper into something.
Right. And also, this industry is ripe for innovation and ripe for exploration. So if, just because something is presently used one way does not mean that it can't be used another way. And we welcome that kind of mindset here, especially if you're an experienced programmer. So, if you have thoughts on how this can be used in a different way than it's currently being used, by all means, have at it.
Yeah, not just how we use current blockchains, but maybe create a new one.
Sure.
We've talked about Ethereum, Hyperledger, we have Bitcoin, but maybe you can create your own blockchain because the concept of blockchain is kind of simple, actually. You can do it with I've seen people do it with like 200 lines of JavaScript. So maybe you can create your own implementation of blockchain with your own rule sets and whatever. And we're, like you said, we need that kind of thing to move this industry forward.
Right. Yeah, totally. Awesome. Well, Bruno, I've really enjoyed our chat today. I'm going to go ahead and close this down. So, if you want to learn more about how to get started with Ethereum, you can definitely check out my website over at dappuniversity.com. My YouTube channel. I've got tons of free tutorials. You can join my free training on my website over at dappuniversity.com/bootcamp. And, Bruno, if people ever have questions for you, is there a place that, they can find you online?
Sure. They can find me on my Instagram and my Twitter. My handles are a little bit long, so I'll just leave them in the description.
Sure.
But yeah, feel free to contact me if you need anything.
Awesome. So we'll catch you all in the next episode. And thanks again for listening in to Adventures in Blockchain. I'll see you guys.
Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with CacheFly. Visit